Elena had always dreamed of wearing the uniform, but when she finally stepped off the bus that first morning, she realized how heavy the dream felt. The training camp was larger and louder than she had imagined. Soldiers barked orders, boots stomped on gravel, and whistles cut through the cold morning air. She clutched the strap of her duffel bag as if it were her lifeline. Around her, other recruits moved quickly, their faces sharp with confidence. Some laughed nervously, others already stood tall as if they had been born to do this. Elena, in comparison, felt small and out of place. She had grown up in a quiet town, the daughter of a mechanic and a schoolteacher. Her father had always told her that courage wasn't about winning, it was about refusing to quit. Those words carried her here, to this training ground, but as she looked around at the hardened faces of her new platoon, she wondered if her father's wisdom would be enough. She wasn't as tall, as fast, or as strong as the others. Even carrying her bag made her shoulders ache, and it was only the first hour of the first day. The drill sergeant stormed into view like a thundercloud. His voice was harsh, demanding silence, demanding order. Elena tried to stand as straight as she could, but her heart thudded wildly in her chest. The first roll call was sharp and quick. She answered with her name, her voice nearly breaking. A few recruits snickered. She felt her cheeks burn, but she kept her eyes forward. The morning began with simple drills, but simple was not the right word. They were told to run across the field, drop for push-ups, spring up for jumping jacks, then run again. Elena's legs trembled within minutes. Her arms gave out on the third set of push-ups. Around her, others pushed forward, their movements crisp and practiced. She was slower, clumsy, her breathing ragged. A recruit behind her muttered, "She's already broken." Another laughed. The word stuck to her like glue broken. By midday, Elena felt every muscle screaming. They had marched, they had run, they had crawled through mud. Her uniform, once clean and stiff, was already streaked with dirt. Her palms were raw from hitting the ground so many times. She tried to keep up with the group, but her steps lagged just enough for the others to notice. Two recruits whispered to each other as they jogged ahead, throwing glances back at her. She heard it again, the word repeated like a chant, broken. At lunch, she sat on the edge of a bench with her tray. The food was plain beans, bread, a slice of meat, but she could barely swallow. Across the table, a few recruits laughed loudly about how some people didn't belong there. She knew they were talking about her. She lowered her gaze and pushed the beans around with her spoon. A kind-looking recruit named Harris gave her a small nod, almost like encouragement, but he didn't say anything. No one wanted to stand out on the first day. The afternoon drills were worse. They were taken to the obstacle course, a winding track filled with walls to climb, ropes to swing, and tunnels to crawl through. Elena's arms shook when she tried to pull herself up the first wall. She slipped twice before making it over, and by then, the rest of the platoon was already halfway through the course. She forced herself to keep going, dirt caking her face, sweat blinding her eyes. At the rope climb, she barely made it off the ground before sliding back down. The laughter of a few recruits cut into her like knives. "She won't last the week," someone said loudly. The drill sergeant's whistle blew sharp and long. "Move faster. This is not a playground," he barked. Elena bit her lip hard enough to taste blood and tried again. She clawed at the rope, her arms burning, her body shaking, but she refused to quit. Inch by inch, she pulled herself higher. By the time she reached the top and swung over, her arms felt like lead, but she did it. She landed hard on the ground, but a flicker of pride warmed her chest. Still, she finished dead last. The platoon was already waiting at the end, some with smirks, others with rolled eyes. The drill sergeant paced in front of them, his boots kicking up dust. "This course will break most of you," he growled. His eyes lingered on Elena for a moment too long. She felt exposed, as if the word broken was now stamped across her forehead. That night, as the recruits settled into their bunks, Elena sat on the edge of hers with a notebook. She wrote a letter, not to be sent, but to steady herself. "Dear Dad," she scribbled, "they think I'm weak. They think I don't belong here. Maybe they're right. But I promised myself I wouldn't quit. I can hear your voice telling me that courage isn't about being the best, it's about showing up again tomorrow. So I will." She closed the notebook and slipped it under her pillow, wiping her eyes quickly before anyone could see. The barracks were filled with snores and muffled whispers as the others drifted to sleep. Elena lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The aches in her body were real, the doubt even more so. But deep inside, under the pain and embarrassment, a small ember burned. They could call her broken all they wanted, but she would not quit on day one. She had come too far to walk away now. In the darkness, as the night settled over the camp, Elena made a silent promise to herself. She would endure tomorrow, and the day after, and every day that followed. They could laugh, they could doubt, they could whisper. But one day, they would see. She wasn't broken. She was unbreakable, even if she had to prove it one step at a time. The second morning came too soon for Elena. Her body still ached from the first day. Every muscle screamed as she rolled out of the bunk, her boots feeling heavier than ever. The whistle blew at dawn, sharp and unforgiving, dragging everyone into line. She straightened her back, even though her shoulders protested. The recruits around her looked sharper, more alert, though some had dark circles under their eyes. Everyone knew the first week was meant to test who had the will to stay. The drill sergeant barked orders, his voice cutting through the cold air. "This is not a vacation. This is where soldiers are made. If you cannot keep up, pack your bags and leave." His eyes swept across the line, pausing for a moment on Elena again. She didn't flinch, though her heart pounded. She could still hear the whispers from yesterday. Broken. Weak. Doesn't belong. The words sat in her chest like stones. But she kept her chin up. The day began with a long march across rough terrain. Each recruit carried a heavy pack, loaded with gear. The straps dug into Elena's shoulders, the weight pulling her down. Her legs felt like lead with every step. Gravel crunched under boots, dust rising in the morning sun. Some recruits sang chants to keep their pace steady, their voices strong and confident. Elena's breath came out ragged, and she struggled to keep in step. The pack felt twice as heavy on her as on anyone else. As the march dragged on, sweat soaked her uniform. She stumbled once on a loose rock, nearly falling, and two recruits behind her laughed. "Told you she wouldn't last," one whispered. Elena clenched her teeth and pushed forward. She remembered her father's words again: strength is refusing to stop. She adjusted her pack and took another step, then another. Every step was a small battle. By the time the march ended, her legs trembled so badly she thought they might give out. The platoon had to line up immediately for drills. There was no rest, no break. The sergeant ordered push-ups in the dirt, then sit-ups, then burpees. Elena dropped to the ground with the rest, her arms shaking with each push. She fell behind quickly. Her face pressed into the dust, her arms collapsing before she could finish the count. "Get up," the sergeant roared. "Don't you dare stop." She forced her body up again, trembling, her eyes stinging with sweat and grit. Some recruits finished early, waiting with smug smiles as Elena struggled through the last set. She was always the last. Always. When she finally rose, chest heaving, the sergeant's stare followed her like a weight. She straightened, refusing to drop her gaze. At lunch, the mess hall buzzed with chatter. Elena sat alone at the edge again, pushing her food around a tray. A group at the next table laughed loudly, one of them imitating the way she had slipped on the rock during the march. Broken, the word drifted across the room like smoke. She looked down at her plate, willing herself not to cry. Harris, the quiet recruit from before, glanced her way again. This time he gave her a firmer nod, as if telling her to hold on. She managed a small, grateful smile, though they didn't speak. The afternoon brought the rifle drills. Each recruit was handed a weapon, taught how to hold it, clean it, and aim. Elena's arms still shook from the morning, and the weight of the rifle felt awkward in her hands. When she aimed at the target, her sight wavered. The shot went wide, far off the mark. Others hit the bullseye cleanly, one after another. She reloaded and tried again, but the second shot wasn't much better. A few recruits chuckled under their breath. The instructor didn't laugh. He just gave her a cold look and said, "You'll keep shooting until you hit." Elena swallowed hard and tried again. Her arms burned, her hands sweaty on the metal. Shot after shot missed. Her ears rang with each blast, her shoulders aching from the recoil. But she refused to give up. Finally, after what felt like endless attempts, the bullet clipped the edge of the target. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. She allowed herself a tiny breath of relief. The instructor gave her a curt nod and moved on. As the sun lowered, the recruits were sent on another run, this time over hills and uneven trails. Elena's legs screamed in protest, but she ran anyway. She started near the back, her chest burning, her breath ragged. One by one, some recruits slowed, gasping for air. She passed two of them, then another, surprising herself. By the time the run ended, she wasn't last. She wasn't first either, but for the first time, she was in the middle. She collapsed to the ground with the others, her chest heaving, but her lips curled into the smallest smile. The whispers still followed her that night in the barracks. Some said she wouldn't last a week. Others called her broken again. But their words felt a little lighter now, less sharp. Because today, she had kept going when some of them had stopped. She wrote another note in her notebook before bed. "Dear Dad, today was harder than yesterday. They still laugh at me, but I didn't stop. I passed some of them today. I think maybe I can keep going. I think maybe you were right. Strength isn't about being the best. It's about standing up when it hurts. And I stood up today." As the lights went out and silence settled over the barracks, Elena lay awake again, sore and exhausted. But this time, there was a flicker of hope under the pain. She wasn't fast, she wasn't strong, and she wasn't perfect. But she was still here. She hadn't quit. That counted for something. She thought of the final run, the one they all whispered about. The hardest test of all. She didn't know how she would face it, but she knew one thing for certain: when that day came, she would not give up. And maybe, just maybe, she would prove them all wrong. The days rolled on, each one heavier than the last. Elena's body had begun to change. Her arms grew stronger, her legs more solid, but the pain never really left. Every morning when the whistle shrieked at dawn, she felt the soreness crawl through her bones. Still, she rose without complaint. She had made it through the first week, and though many still whispered, she noticed some faces no longer laughed quite as loudly. A few recruits had already left, unable to take the constant grind of training. Elena, despite stumbling and struggling, was still standing. The weather turned harsh in the third week. Clouds rolled in, and storms rattled the camp at night. The ground stayed wet and slippery, making the runs harder and the obstacle courses more dangerous. The recruits were told they would continue no matter the conditions. "The battlefield doesn't wait for sunshine," the drill sergeant growled. Elena's boots were soaked most mornings before she even finished the first drill. Mud clung to her uniform, heavy and cold. She slipped often, but she always got back up. It was during one of these stormy nights that the turning point came. The recruits were woken suddenly after midnight, ordered out into the rain for a surprise endurance exercise. Lightning flashed across the sky as they were marched deep into the woods. The rain poured so hard Elena could barely see the person in front of her. The mud sucked at her boots, making each step a battle. Some recruits grumbled, others cursed under their breath. The sergeant's voice cut through the storm, reminding them that soldiers had no comfort, only duty. After hours of running and crawling through mud, the group reached a clearing where they were told to carry out a rescue drill. Each recruit had to carry another across a marked stretch of ground, simulating pulling a wounded comrade to safety. The stronger recruits paired quickly, lifting each other with grins and proving their strength. Elena was left standing awkwardly at the edge until a tall recruit named Simmons shrugged and agreed to pair with her. He was heavier than she had expected, and when she first tried to lift him across her shoulders, her knees buckled. The laughter came quick. "She can't even lift him," someone muttered. Elena felt her face burn as the rain pelted her. Simmons shifted, ready to drop down and walk himself, but Elena shook her head. "Don't," she said quietly, her voice drowned by the storm. She tried again, gripping tighter, forcing her legs to steady under the weight. Her back screamed, her shoulders felt like they were splitting, but she pushed forward, one step, then another. The mud made it worse, every step sliding, every muscle in her body trembling. She could hear the others shouting, some cheering, some mocking, but she kept her eyes forward. Simmons was silent, his body heavy on her shoulders. Halfway through, her legs nearly gave out, and for a moment she thought she would collapse face first into the mud. But something inside her refused. She remembered the word they had called her broken. She remembered writing to her father, promising she would not quit. She screamed against the storm, a raw sound of defiance, and kept moving. Step by step, she reached the other side of the clearing and dropped Simmons down safely. The sergeant's whistle blew sharp, not in anger this time but in acknowledgement. "That," he shouted over the storm, "is what not giving up looks like." The recruits who had laughed were quiet now, their smirks fading in the lightning's glow. Elena collapsed to her knees in the mud, her chest heaving, her arms limp. But inside, a fire blazed. She had done it. The days that followed felt different. The whispers of broken still surfaced, but not as often, and not as loud. A few recruits even began to nod at her during drills, silent acknowledgements of what she had done. Harris, who had always given her quiet encouragement, clapped her on the shoulder after one march. "Not bad," he said simply, but his words carried weight. Elena's endurance grew. She still wasn't the fastest, and she still missed targets on the range more often than she liked, but she lasted. When others dropped out during long runs, she pushed on. When others cursed the weight of their packs, she adjusted hers and kept walking. Her progress was slow, steady, like a stone wearing down a river. By the 5th week, the talk among the recruits shifted to the final run, the infamous test that loomed at the end of training. It was longer than anything they had done before, harsher, with full gear and no rest breaks. Everyone feared it, even the strongest. Some trained harder, some boasted they would crush it, but everyone knew it was the true measure of endurance. Elena thought of it often, sometimes with fear, sometimes with determination. She didn't know if she could finish it, but she knew she would not quit. One evening, during a group run, the rain returned. The ground turned slick, and one recruit slipped badly, twisting his ankle. He cried out, falling behind as the group surged ahead. The sergeant shouted for them to keep moving, but Elena glanced back and saw the pain on his face. Without thinking, she slowed, looping his arm over her shoulder and half carrying him forward. The extra weight nearly pulled her down, but she steadied herself and forced her legs to keep moving. The group was far ahead by the time she and the injured recruit stumbled to the end, but the sergeant did not scold her. He gave her a hard look, one she could not read, and blew the whistle once to signal completion. That night, as she wrote another note in her notebook, she realized something had shifted. "Dear Dad," she scribbled, "I'm not the best here. I'm not even close. But I'm still here. I carried Simmons through the mud. I helped another finish the run. I think maybe I'm starting to prove to them that I belong. Maybe I'm proving it to myself too." The stormy nights continued, the drills never softened, but Elena's place in the platoon was no longer just as the one who struggled. She was the one who refused to quit. The sergeant's eyes followed her differently now, not with disdain but with calculation, as if he was measuring how far she could go. The others no longer only saw weakness when they looked at her. They saw grit. And as the final run drew closer, a silent expectation began to build. Many doubted she could finish it. But after what she had shown in the storm, after the night she had carried more than her share, a quiet thought crept into the platoon: maybe, just maybe, she had more inside her than anyone had guessed. The day of the final run arrived with a stillness that felt almost unnatural. The air was heavy, the sky a dull gray, and the recruits stood in formation, their packs already strapped to their backs. The weight was more than any of them had carried before, filled with gear that pressed hard against their shoulders. Elena adjusted her straps, her fingers steady even though her stomach twisted with nerves. She had been thinking of this day for weeks, imagining every step, every hill, every ache. Now it was here, and there was no turning back. The drill sergeant stood before them, his face unreadable. "This is it," he said, his voice carrying over the silent field. "This is the test that decides if you have what it takes. No excuses, no mercy. You will run until the end or you will fall. Some of you will quit today. Some of you will fail today. But if you finish, you will know you belong." His eyes swept across the platoon, resting on Elena for a long moment before moving on. The whistle blew, and they were off. The sound of boots hitting the dirt echoed across the field as the platoon surged forward. Some recruits sprinted ahead, determined to prove their strength early. Others set a steady pace, saving their energy. Elena started near the back, her steps measured, her breathing controlled. She remembered all the times she had stumbled, all the whispers of broken, and she refused to let those words decide this run for her. The first mile was steady, the ground flat and dry. Elena focused on her breathing, in through the nose, out through the mouth. She ignored the recruits who sped past her, knowing that speed meant nothing if she burned out early. The pack pulled hard against her shoulders, her arms already aching, but she tightened her grip on the straps and kept moving. By the third mile, the trail began to rise, the hills rolling one after another. The recruits who had started too fast began to slow, their breaths ragged. Elena kept her steady pace, moving past two, then three who stumbled. Her legs burned, but she didn't stop. She thought of her father, of his quiet lessons about endurance, and she held onto those words like armor. The sun broke through the clouds as they reached the halfway point, beating down on their backs. Sweat soaked Elena's uniform, dripping into her eyes. She wiped her face quickly and kept running. The path grew rougher, rocks jutting out, the ground uneven. A recruit ahead tripped, falling hard. He cursed, clutching his knee. Elena slowed for a moment, her instinct to help pulling at her, but the instructors shouted for him to stay down and wait for medical aid. She clenched her jaw and moved on, her chest heavy with the choice. By mile 6, exhaustion began to creep in like a shadow. Elena's breath came in sharp gasps, her legs trembling with every step. Her pack felt like it had doubled in weight, her shoulders raw under the straps. Around her, recruits dropped out one by one, collapsing on the side of the trail, their faces pale with defeat. The instructors didn't shout at them. They simply marked their names and moved on. Elena's vision blurred as sweat stung her eyes, but she fixed her gaze on the path ahead. She whispered to herself with every step, a rhythm to keep her moving. One more. One more. One more. The words became a drum beat in her mind, drowning out the pain, drowning out the doubt. Then came the steep hill, the part of the course every recruit feared. It rose like a wall, dirt loose beneath their boots, the kind of climb that drained even the strongest. Some tried to charge up and failed, sliding back down. Others crawled on hands and knees. Elena tightened her jaw and leaned forward, her legs screaming as she forced them to lift again and again. Halfway up, her body begged her to stop. Her lungs burned, her heart thundered, her arms numb from holding the pack. She thought she might fall, but then she remembered the night in the storm, carrying Simmons through the mud. She remembered the weight of another body on her shoulders and how she had refused to collapse. Compared to that night, this was just another climb. Step by step, she pulled herself upward until she reached the top. She nearly collapsed, her body trembling, but she didn't stop moving. The trail leveled out, and she forced her legs into a jog again. She had passed more recruits than she realized, strong ones who had been ahead of her at the start. Some stared at her in disbelief as she moved past, their faces pale with exhaustion. The last mile stretched before them like an endless road. Elena's body was nearly at its limit. Every breath felt like fire, every step like knives in her legs. Her pack dug into her shoulders so deeply she thought her skin might split. But something deeper than pain pushed her forward. She thought of her father's voice, calm and steady, telling her that strength was quiet. She thought of the word broken and how it had followed her since day one. And she thought of the silence that would come if she proved them all wrong. With the finish line still distant, she saw two of the fastest recruits ahead of her. They staggered, slowing, their bodies failing after their early sprint. Elena's pace never wavered. She moved past them, her steps heavy but sure. Their eyes widened as she passed, disbelief written across their faces. She didn't look back. The final stretch came into view, the flags marking the end of the run. The recruits who had already collapsed sat on the sidelines, their faces a mixture of defeat and awe. The instructors stood ready, their clipboards in hand, their eyes sharp. The drill sergeant stood at the finish, arms crossed, his face unreadable. Elena's vision swam, her body screamed for rest, but she pushed harder. Her legs moved on instinct now, driven by something greater than strength, driven by the promise she had made to herself. The cheers of the recruits who watched barely registered in her ears. All she could hear was the pounding of her heart and the word that had haunted her since day one. Broken. 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 She crossed the finish line not last, not even in the middle. She crossed near the front, ahead of recruits who had once mocked her, ahead of the ones who had laughed. And when she stumbled to a stop, her chest heaving, her face streaked with sweat and dirt, the field went strangely quiet. The silence was louder than any cheer. The drill sergeant stepped forward, his boots crunching on the dirt. He looked at her for a long moment, his expression finally breaking into the smallest hint of approval. "That," he said loudly, his voice carrying to every corner of the field, "is what unbreakable looks like." Elena couldn't speak. She dropped to her knees, her body spent, but her heart soared. She had done it. She had crushed the run they all feared. And for the first time since stepping off the bus on day one, no one called her broken. The field was silent for a long moment after Elena crossed the finish line. The other recruits watched, their eyes wide, unable to fully process what had just happened. Some had never expected her to make it this far. Others had assumed she would fall behind early, proving, in their minds, that the whispers of broken had been true. But she hadn't fallen. She had finished, and she had done it with strength, precision, and a quiet determination that left everyone frozen. Elena sank to the ground, her knees pressed into the dirt, the pack finally sliding from her shoulders. Her muscles screamed in protest, every inch of her body begging for rest, but there was no sense of failure now, only the strange, powerful joy of accomplishment. She had faced every challenge, every hill, every step of this brutal run, and she had overcome them all. She had proven more to herself than anyone else. The drill sergeant approached her slowly, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust. He crouched slightly to meet her eye level. "You've done something today that most of them will never understand," he said, his voice low but clear. "You carried yourself through pain, through exhaustion, through doubt, and you didn't break. You finished. That is what counts." Elena could barely speak, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. I I just kept moving," she managed, her voice hoarse. "One step at a time. That's all it ever takes," the sergeant replied, standing upright again. "One step at a time. Never let anyone tell you what you are before you show them who you really are." He gestured toward the other recruits, who were slowly picking themselves up, some cheering quietly, others staring with a mixture of disbelief and admiration. "They will remember this day. And they will remember you." Elena's eyes scanned the field. She saw the two recruits she had passed on the last mile sitting together, their hands on their knees, their faces pale with exhaustion. They looked at her with a kind of stunned respect. She had shattered their assumptions, just as she had shattered everyone else's expectations. Even the ones who had started the run faster than her had fallen behind. Some looked away, too proud to admit how impressed they were. Others whispered quietly among themselves, nodding and pointing toward her. The instructors began to record names, noting who had finished, who had faltered, and who had given everything they had. Elena's name went at the top of the list, marked not only for completion but for the manner in which she had completed it. Her performance was exceptional, and it could not be ignored. She had carried herself with a quiet, unstoppable resolve that few had the courage or stamina to match. As the recruits gathered their things, Elena slowly rose to her feet. Every joint in her body ached, her legs threatening to buckle with each step, her shoulders raw from the straps of her pack. Yet, despite the pain, there was a glow in her eyes, a fire that had been absent on day one. The same fire that had driven her through every drill, every obstacle, every whispered insult. The fire that had carried her to the finish line. Her fellow recruits started to approach her cautiously. Some offered words of congratulations, still uncertain how to react to someone they had all underestimated. I I didn't think you'd make it," one admitted, his voice quiet, almost ashamed. "I was wrong." Elena smiled, faint but genuine. "Neither did I," she said. "But I had to try." Another recruit, a tall, broad-shouldered man who had been one of the fastest at the start, stepped forward, his face serious but respectful. "You pushed all of us harder than we thought possible," he said. "You didn't just finish, you set the pace, even at the end." Elena shook her head slightly. "I just focused on the steps ahead. That's all anyone can do." Slowly, more recruits joined in, forming a circle around her. Their earlier doubt had melted into something new, respect. They saw her not as someone broken, not as a weak link, but as a force. The quiet strength that had carried her through the run had transformed their perception, leaving them in awe. They had underestimated her on day one, and now, they could see clearly how wrong they had been. Even the recruits who had completed the run ahead of her looked differently at her now. She had not only finished but had done so with a resilience that inspired them. They realized that speed and initial strength meant little without endurance, discipline, and heart. And Elena had proven she had all of them in abundance. The drill sergeant blew his whistle, calling everyone to attention. The recruits straightened, some still panting heavily, others trembling from exhaustion. "Listen up," he barked. "Today, one of your own has shown you what it means to endure. One of your own has shown what it looks like to refuse to break. Take note, because this is the standard from now on. Not just in this platoon, but in life." He stepped closer to Elena, his eyes narrowing in appraisal. You have taken a title that no one can take from you, unbreakable. Remember that word. Carry it with you. Let it remind you of who you are when times get hard, when the trail gets steep, and when everyone doubts you. You have earned it. Elena's heart pounded as she absorbed his words. The weight of the title, of the acknowledgement, settled over her in a way she had never expected. For years, she had carried the invisible burden of being broken, of being underestimated, of having others doubt her every capability. And now, the very same people who had doubted her could see the truth. She was stronger, braver, and more resilient than any label could ever define. The instructors began to disperse the group, signaling the end of the run. Recruits moved slowly, some laughing weakly, others collapsing into the dirt or onto their packs, catching their breath. Elena walked among them, offering nods and quiet smiles. She was exhausted beyond words, but she also felt lighter than she had in years. She had survived, yes, but she had thrived. And the memory of this day, the memory of her triumph, would remain with her long after the aches faded. Her mind wandered briefly to the first day she had arrived at the camp, to the way the whispers had followed her, to the way the drill sergeant had looked at her with suspicion. Everything had changed since then. Every struggle, every harsh word, every moment of doubt had been necessary to get her here. She had transformed not because others had demanded it, but because she had chosen it herself. Even as the day faded and the sun dipped lower in the sky, Elena remained standing, her uniform dirt-streaked, her face sweaty and tired, yet shining with quiet triumph. Recruits filed past her, some offering a nod of acknowledgement, others saying softly, "Well done." Each word landed like a feather on her heart, gentle but powerful. She had achieved what no one thought she could, and in doing so, she had changed the perception of everyone around her. Finally, the drill sergeant called a halt to all movement. "You've all done well today," he said, his voice loud but calm. "Some of you found limits you didn't know you had. Some of you discovered strengths you never imagined. And some of you, like Elena, have reminded us all that labels don't define potential. They never will." The field erupted in a quiet murmur of agreement. Elena felt the eyes of her platoon mates on her once more. Their stares were no longer of doubt, but of respect, of awe, of recognition. She had earned their admiration not through words, but through action, through persistence, and through the courage to keep moving when every part of her screamed to stop. As the recruits gathered for the final roll call, Elena stood quietly at the edge of the formation, her body aching but her spirit soaring. She had finished the run, yes, but more than that, she had finished it on her own terms, on her own strength. And as the drill sergeant finally dismissed them, his words echoing in the still air, Elena realized something profound: she had not only survived. She had shown the world and herself that she was, in every way, unbreakable. She walked off the field slowly, each step a testament to everything she had endured and overcome. The whispers of broken were gone now, replaced by something else, a deep, unshakable understanding that her strength had always been inside her, waiting for the moment she would prove it. And she had.